All right, so this will be week 5. We're going to be going through a pretty in-depth dive of accident investigation generally, and we will probably end up uh, carrying this on to next week as well. So first, we're going to be looking at steps of an accident investigation. And before we get there, let's just revisit some of these definitions we've dealt with the whole class. So root cause is your fundamental causal factor that if you correct it, the accident would not occur. Causal factor is a factor that shaped the outcome of the situation, but it's not a root cause. Extent of conditions, that's an activity where you're going to explore to what extent the condition that led to the accident is present in other areas of the organization or process. We have barriers, or also can be referred to as controls. These are physical or administrative controls designed to promote consistent performance and defend against inappropriate actions. Corrective action, these are the things that you're going to assign after the fact to try to remedy whatever the problem was. And last, an extent of cause, similarly to extent of condition. This is an activity you will undergo where you're going to be assessing your entire organization or process for the presence of that root cause again. So what is an accident? Common definition is an accident is the final event in an unplanned series of unique events that results in an injury or illness to an employee and may include property damage. It is the final result or effect of a number of surface and root causes. So core pieces of the accident are bolded here. We have, oops, no. So we have an event. I'm going to change the colors here. An injury or an illness. We also have something unplanned and an employee. So what's the event? What does unplanned mean for this definition? Injury or illness matters. Why? And why is the employee specific? And to break this down a little bit, right? What is an event? Well, we have to have an event, right? We have to have some arbitrary distinction for us to ground everything to. When we talk about unplanned, right? What does unplanned matter? Well, like what we've talked about before, an accident is fundamentally unintentional as a matter of definition. It can't be have intentionality to it, or it wouldn't be an accident. Injury or illness matters, and why do we think that? Well, that's because we have to have an effect or some negative result that we're looking at. And why is employee specifically called out? Because we're using this definition, which is focused predominantly on employer-employee interactions. I'm pretty sure this definition is from OSHA or is a derivation of the OSHA definition, and so that's their focus. But realistically, this definition isn't, you know, we don't have to be bound to it in any way. You can imagine accidents that maybe don't have an injury or illness and are just property damage, or don't affect an employee, they affect a member of the public or something. So again, theme of this course, right? Don't get bogged down in any one thing. Don't anchor yourself to any one theory or approach, because what you're dealing with might be different. So really quick, bureaucratic nitpicking. This is something you will see in some organizations or some specific application spaces. There might be regulations or regulatory reasons for this, but what we're looking at here, right, is accidents or incidents. So this is sometimes a difference that you will have thrown at you, right? And an accident requires some injury, and incidents are when the same thing happened, but there wasn't an injury. Just a little nitpicky thing if you run into that. That's usually the distinction they're making. But again, if you're unsure, make sure to ask whoever is the source truth for your investigation, so you're in line with their expectations. But to me, it's semantic gobbledygook. So, types of accidents. So we're going to have injury, illness, damage, failure, and failure specifically in this instance, right? An accident will, by definition, have a failed action somewhere, but we're talking about failure as a matter of a system or process, some preordained sequence of events failed to achieve its objective. And we think about, a question for you guys is any other examples of accidents, besides one of these aspects. And remember, also notice, these are all consequential. These are all the results, right? So that begs the question, right? Can you have an accident without the result? What would that look like? Can we think of any examples where an accident could still be an accident without having a defined result? Remember, just relevant regulators and regulations, like I've talked about before. Your application space may be different than others. So, for example, an investigation under OSHA might have different steps and assumptions and just aspects or methods than one under like the National Traffic Safety Board or Transportation Safety Board, or police departments might have a different one. You always want to make sure you're grounding your stuff in whatever you're supposed to be. So some obvious ones, right? You're going to have OSHA, NTSB. NTSB is going to govern all your transportation stuff somewhat. There's also the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, I think. It's the NHTSA, I believe. And then FMCSA is Federal Motor Carriers Safety Administration. This is for commercial truck driving. FDA will have their own. National Safety Council might. Obviously, your law enforcement agencies might have a different one. This is where like fire departments might fall in, right? NIOSH is typically, this is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. So NIOSH and OSHA go together well. So you want to understand what jurisdiction you're under and adhere to those guidelines. And just a reminder, why do we have regulations? Why do we regulate safety? Why is it deemed an important societal function? That's important to note and just to remember, and I guess even think back and consider, at what levels did we regulate safety before? In human history, right? It almost certainly has waned and increased throughout the years and throughout different cultures, but that's an aspect here, right? We want to understand, okay, what's the ultimate premise? This will actually help if you have a good grounded philosophy about this stuff. Will help as you start to develop corrective actions, as you're looking at causal factors, you'll ground it in a way that's appropriate to you. So obviously capitalistic reasons, it costs money to not regulate safety. Again, that's due to modern legal structures of torts and different things there. Its fundamental power of government is to regulate for the common good, right? And we tend to deem others' well-being as important. And, are we entitled to safety? This is a novel concept. Until relatively recently in American history, we weren't entitled to safety. If you're not sure about that, just read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, or explore any kind of industrial or operational review of industries, agriculture in the 18th century or whatnot. But this is one of those things we want to consider, right? Are we entitled to safety in the workplace, in public, or in our homes? All of these also have different nuances. So we might be, an accident taking place in any of these might have different characteristics, components, or expectations. So this will be a review somewhat probably if you've taken accident investigation, especially if you've taken it from me. But there are 7 steps to the accident investigation. This list is the general 7, but again, going back, certain regulatory bodies might have different steps, or the steps might be in different orders or things. So always adhere to that. But this is the general vibe. You're going to secure the scene, document the scene. Now keep in mind, in the sense of a human performance field investigation, you're typically coming in right around there. So securing and documenting the scene, I mean, unless you happen to be there or you're a first responder of some kind, you're not going to be doing that a lot. A lot of human performance investigation takes place after the fact. Then we conduct our interviews, develop sequence of events, conduct surface and root cause analysis, determine solutions, and write the report. And we'll go through each of those steps. So securing the scene. Why do we secure the scene? To understand the immediate context as much as possible. Material evidence deteriorates after time, or it just goes away. Think about certain chemical spills and stuff. You know, your chemicals may just evaporate, or those kind of aspects. And keep in mind, this is going to be a theme throughout this presentation. This part right here. Memory is a huge risk in any accident investigation. It is far and away the greatest risk to actually conducting the investigation, developing corrective actions, and solving the problem is going to be the limitations of human memory. We'll talk about memory now. Perfect. So keep in mind, we talked about this a little bit before. You're going to immediately receive sensory information. That lands there. It decays rapidly on the order of seconds. It will get moved to short-term memory if that immediate sensory level processing deems it relevant. These are typically changes to environment, some of those aspects. And then it gets handled in working memory. Working memory then is where we make the final determination of, is this important? Like actually important. And if so, the memory gets chunked and gets ported over here to long-term memory, which then it will filter down, wherever it's going to live. So consider this chart here. Where are we during an accident investigation? So you're probably, in terms of the people involved, like we're coming in fresh and we will have our own sense memories about the information we're experiencing as we get it. But the people who have already been through it, they're long past this time. So what does that mean? They didn't remember everything, ever. So by definition, some details of this accident will have been deleted because for whatever reason, they have been filtered out as not important, or they've fallen prey to all sorts of other weird memory quirks. But it's important to remember that when you come in to start your interviews and kind of digging around, you're only going to be handling stuff that for those people has lived in long-term memory. So that really brings up the question, right? How reliable can we expect memory to be? And keep in mind, we've talked about this before. We briefly talked about this in the visual section about how our brains will fill in information that is missing with whatever we think is most likely. And so that's where we get into why is first-person testimony bad. You'll see this discussed in the sense of witnesses in criminal investigations and things. But the problem is, is not only is memory influenced by everything all the time, but humans weren't designed to have really precise memories. That is not what our memory is good for. So that's just important to keep in mind, though, right? Is all of this information from sense memory and working memory may not be there by the time you get there. Some of it definitely won't be. Only the stuff that individual decided to port over to long-term memory. And I say decided, but keep in mind most of this is not happening consciously. So schemas. We talked a little bit about this before, but this is An example could be knowing the general process for waiting in a line when you walk into a store. There aren't signs that instruct you to wait in a line or where the line starts. We just kind of have a vibe, let's say, of that. And that's because we're pulling on a schema of general processes in a store. Um, and schemas are extremely valuable. It's one of the things our brain is incredible at. We take those chunks of information and we can assemble them to develop a procedure or an exemplar form of the action. So what's the optimal version, right? Anybody who's ever watched basketball or played basketball, we're totally great at remembering what a perfect jump shot looks like and feels like and such. Putting it into practice, different story. So it's important to understand that and kind of how this works. So when you're coming in and you're asking people to retrieve from long-term memory, you're effectively asking for schemas. And schemas, like everything else that we've talked about, have bottom-up, effects where they can modify or adjust our top-level processing, and vice versa. A schema could exert pressure from the top down to change what our sense memory maybe, and those kind of things if we're not cautious and aware of it. And all this memory stuff, just keep in mind, memory is fragile. It can be manipulated very easily and subconsciously. This is one of my favorite experiments. One of these days, I will update this slide to have the actual citation. That is not this day. So they took some individuals and essentially implanted a memory of being lost in a mall and revisited, and these people never were, I can't remember exactly the process, but they were screened for this type of an instance. Well, they then, through essentially like a version of like cognitive behavioral therapy or something, they were given pieces of a memory of, oh yeah, don't you remember that time you got lost in the mall and couldn't find your parents and stuff? And what these people were able to do, because kid getting lost in the mall, this is a relatively generic storyline. We've heard about it in the news, we've seen it in movies, TV shows, whatever. So what these people did is essentially created out of whole cloth a very detailed memory. They could remember what the mall looked like, what color shirt they were wearing, what stores they were by, and it was all nonsense. It was all made up. And so you have to keep that in mind, is memory is easily influenced and manipulated. And that's why we always say, you have to validate with evidence and proof. Memory alone isn't enough, because Bob said so is not a good enough piece of evidence there, right? We need objective evidence. This might be camera footage, examples from the scene, documentation, sketches, whatever, and then the subjective evidence from our interviews. And then we can assemble a reasonable picture of what actually occurred. Okay, so stepping into documenting the accident scene. Like I said, for human performance stuff, probably won't fall into this kind of path. Probably won't be expected to do this stuff, but just to be safe, you might have an accident investigation kit. This is common in certain highly regulated fields. So from my understanding, OSHA has a specific accident investigation kit it may use with standard forms and things. So be aware if they're there. And they can be helpful, or they also obviously can be required. So how do you know what matters and what needs documented? Initially, you won't have a clue. So what about your events? So as we've talked about different events, or as you're pulling ones out of set phasers to stun, was anything recorded that wasn't used, or did anything unexpected become important? Experience is kind of going to be the only thing to tell you, at least in a sense. But right, from what we know, sense information, short-term memory, those are the things we're going to lose. So as you're documenting the scene, any evidence of that nature. This is where you involve all five senses right here. What does it smell like? If you're right there, you know, a first responder, you note these things. What's it smell like? What did you hear? Those kind of things, because those are going to be the first things to go and might have relevance. Probably won't, but they might. So that's your only kind of clue, right? Is okay, you want to document as much as possible the big picture, but this is one area where you want to focus on the trees a little bit, not the forest. And as you gain more experience, right, with more experienced investigators, you'll learn other tricks and different things that, are relevant. So your environment matters, obviously. That's kind of part of using their senses. Always draw and sketch the scene, even if you're not a good artist. We are visual creatures. We talked about that in the visual section. We can, even if it's not artistically accurate or whatever, there are components of our visual processing that are incredibly powerful. And it also is a very useful uh, tool for consider like memory purity almost. So how to keep your memories uncorrupted. A visual aid can be extremely helpful. And yeah, pictures, videos, drawings, critical and future steps as we go through the rest of the investigation. And here's some examples of sketching, depending on your process. Some people will do timelines, or they'll do triangulations, especially if there's a need for distances and things. It really is just, you can look in your specific application space. If there are public investigations that were ran, maybe you can find the reports or something and see what was used. The next step's initial statement collection. Again, this is probably going to be a first responder type thing, but the first thing I always ask and I'll cover this in the interviewing section too, is can you tell me anybody else we should talk to or who might have helpful information? You always start with that for a couple different reasons. One, you're immediately making them an expert. You don't know who to talk to, but they might, which has a subconscious effect of setting them at ease a little bit more. And also, you're going to need that information, and you want them to be as open as possible about giving it to you. This is also how I recommend ending every interview, but you want to talk about it there. You want to ask, has anything been moved or changed about the scene since the accident? The people who were a part of it, especially at an initial time period, might have some really good information about the overall security of the scene, or, oh, there was, this box there, it's no longer there, I don't know what happened, but that gives you something then to chase after. He goes on to talk about finding cause, not blame. First impressions matter and will help you as you get down this path. And remember, no one wants to talk to the guy or gal deciding if they get fired. So that's an important thing to stress, is that as an investigator, you have no role in HR matters. You're just trying to figure out what caused everything, not who's to blame. And some people will believe you or not. It kind of just depends. So stepping into the interviewing space, and this is where I said, if you can find a really good salesperson and watch what they do and how they are able to just set people at ease. What you also notice is they tend to be repetitive. Really good salespeople are. They find specific, scripts that work on certain people. And how they develop those incredibly interesting and can be valuable for your steps. So fundamentally, an interview is a form of oral communication involving two parties, at least one of whom has a preconceived and serious purpose, and involving the asking and answering of questions. So it's more formal than a conversation. Note-taking plays a part, and the point is to gather information. So 4 critical elements of a good interview. First, preparation. Opening, this is where we talk about first impression manner. Your overall questioning process, and closing. So we talk about preparation. You need to know your 5 W's and your H for your interview process and goals. So what are you looking for? How, etc., etc. Your opening is going to set the tone and establish your trust and rapport. Your overall questioning process. Have a plan for the interview and know your question strategy. This aspect here is something that you'll sometimes hear if you know anybody who's a lawyer or generally in that space, right? A good lawyer never asks a question they don't already know the answer to. You kind of want to have, you're not going to know the answer to these questions, but you need to know, you can, we'll talk about it, you can start from one end or the other. You can start from, I need to know this thing. So what information would be useful to assemble that piece of knowledge? Like what happened, when it happened, where, those details. So that will help drive your questions. But you don't want to have a rigid script, but you need to know where you're going. And this is practice basically. Closing. So follow-up information or additional context, and you reestablish the tone. You reflect the tone from the opening, and you get your additional context. This is, again, we ask them, hey, thanks for your time. Can you tell me anybody else, who might have some information here? We're putting them back in the expert place, and we're reestablishing that tone of like, look, we're not the experts on this at all. This person, even if they're not a quote unquote expert, is more expert than us. So if you set that out, people will generally be more open to you. So as you're preparing, you'll have a timeline sketched. So this is you're going to develop your list of interviewees and questions. A point just to mention on this developing list of interviewees, as you are working through an event, you will have various subject matter experts, folks that'll give you, talk to these 8 people or whatever. That's not gospel, and you should never take it as such. So that's where you develop your initial list of interviewees. Part of that, it could be from management, but do your own research, okay? So find others on your own. Not like management's going to steer you aside, but they will. Everybody has an agenda at all times. So we want to, make sure nobody's stacking the deck in a certain for a certain context. And then you'll develop your list of questions. This next step is really important. You need to develop an error-free or optimal scenario. So what's the perfect way this situation, this process, this task is executed? What's perfection look like? Because then you're going to be comparing everything you hear against that to see where are your deviations, right? Do you find out, everybody deviates from every single step because this process is 15 years old and nobody uses it really anymore, etc. That could just be an example. Be mindful of your environment. This is partially about, just general prep. They say when you're taking a test, you should, do it if you're practicing, you should do it in an area similar to the test. That's environmental memory encoding stuff. But also, I like to note this mindful of your environment is also the context that you're working in. What's the environment of the organization, of the accident? Is this a situation where this accident's going to put this company under if they're liable for something? I mean, just, again, be mindful, right? We make no assumptions and we take in all information. So plan most of your questions. This will be the difference between a structured interview and a non-structured interview. Now, we've talked about enough of the human factor stuff and user experience stuff where we're talking a lot about that is unstructured interviewing techniques or think alouds, those kind of things. But in an interview space, you will also have structured, and you will, like I said, you'll generally know where you're going. But don't hesitate if during your interview your participant brings up a novel line of inquiry that you hadn't considered, and follow that down. You still want to try to use structured method for what you're asking, but it won't be on your list, right? And then just make sure you get back to your list when you're done there. Allow time between interviews. This is absolutely critical. Sometimes people don't do this, and that is terrible. Because remember how our memory works. You're going to be taking all these notes, but they're probably going to be fast and not very organized. And you're going to come back to them 5 days later? No, that will not be successful. You need at least a little bit of time, organize what you just heard, make your own notes, and kind of capture where you're at there. And develop shorthand as needed. This is kind of, everybody I think kind of develops their own over time, but you might want to, you might have your own. So that's just also to speed up your note taking. Opening. So some people think, well, asking the questions is the most important part of the interview. They are false. The opening is the most important part of the interview. It literally governs every single interaction you will have with this person probably for the rest of time. So you need to set the tone, define your scope and intent. This is where we talk about with them, ooh, that's bad, cause, not blame. And you stress, you don't have the authority to make HR decisions. That's not your role. You can't say whether or not they're going to be fired or have negative things. You're just trying to figure out what happened. First impressions are very important. You should put the interviewer at ease. You orient the interviewer to the purpose of the interview, and you establish your own credibility. If you do this right, the rest of it's pretty easy. So some of the information you're going to give them during the opening. What are you going to be covering? Direct answers to any questions. You don't give it opinions, and you don't ever use the words I think or I believe. If you don't know the answer such that you can give a direct answer to it, you say you don't know and then provide the answer later. Now, make sure you actually provide the answer later because these people will be expecting it and you don't want to have your first interaction be a lie. So some common things they may ask, what will you do with what I tell you? Will you use my name? How long is this going to take? And why me? And you should have answers to all of these things. Some of these, what will you do with the information I tell you? This is one that you might need clarification from your management chain, right? But you should be able to give an answer, not, oh, I don't know, or it'll go into the report. Is their name going to be used, or is this anonymous? You need to have answers to these. These are not ones you can say, I don't know. By the way, you have to have answers to these ones. So. Type of questions. This is probably something you're familiar with, but the difference between open questions and closed questions. Closed questions will have a yes or no answer. Open ones will not. And you will use both. It kind of depends on the process and what you're trying to get at. But know when to use both. Otherwise, you can sometimes find yourself asking a question that's odd or like it isn't structured right, and it can be jarring and just a weird vibe. The whole point of this, right? These people are in an accident investigation and you're asking questions. They're already going to be kind of jumpy. So we want to try to just be as consistent and level as possible. Now, this is the big one. Leading or neutral questions. You might actually use leading questions at times. This is in a courtroom. But you need to know the difference and when to use them and why you would use each. Leading questions, you're typically looking to validate an assumption. And keep in mind, most people will just by default try to validate your assumptions. That is just a thing people do. So that's one big aspect that leading questions are problematic. That's also why they're not allowed in court usually. But as you go through writing your questions, right, just make sure your question doesn't have an assumed answer. That's usually how I would catch them, is am I asking a question that already has an assumed answer? Either you already know what you think they're going to say, or you're expecting them to tell you a certain thing, which in this sense of don't you think you need more engineers? That's a yes or no. Yes or no. But that doesn't actually give you any real information. You're just validating or invalidating an assumption. So you typically don't want to use leading questions, but they have their place. So questioning strategies, funnel or inverted funnel, they're not necessarily required, but it can be a natural way to plan the interview. So mine's kind of like you stacked this one on top of this one. I try to start with some closed questions because they involve defined answers. Um, they're a little bit more predictable, and I'll kind of survey the scene, so to speak, of where open questions might be more useful. Closed-ended questions, you can, again, if you're well prepared, you can sense when the dead end is coming, when you're going to get to the end of that line of inquiry. And it's best to do that with closed answer questions if you can, then open. But this is something with practice, though, because as you're going through, if you're just closed ending stuff, you might, depending on how you ask, you might end up thinking there's a dead end, but you just went down the wrong branch of that line of inquiry. So I typically would recommend, as you're starting, pick one and go through it. My process is kind of closed to open to closed. Um, Closed questions, okay, I'm going to feel it out. Move to open-ended questions. Let's really dig in here. And then filter back down to closed-ended questions where you're likely going to be validating stuff that you learned in the open-ended section, but, kind of depends. So listening, this is one of the biggest struggles most people have. We're not great at listening as people generally. Um, so here's some of the problems you're going to have. You're going to have visual or audible distractions. Talking over people, that's especially a problem in the Zoom space. If you're doing remote interviews, that can be a nightmare. So you typically have to have a defined process maybe of when people are done. Jumping to conclusions, prejudice and bias, and closed-mindedness. These are going to be the three biggest problems. They're going to be describing situations, and without thinking about it, you're going to jump to, oh, that was a wacky thing to do, or that doesn't make a lot of sense, or whatever. Keep in mind, it obviously made sense to them in the time, and they are more of an expert than you by definition. So give them the benefit of the doubt. And this is something that takes practice and just, your own, I guess, your own mentality and kind of inborn nature will affect some of this, but also just be aware of the traps. And here are some solutions to this. So maintain eye contact, reduce noise level. This is a big one, right? Silent cell phones, those kind of things. Ask one question and wait. And then you listen to the answer before you judge. Don't walk in with any preconceived notions. This is a really hard one. We are really, really good at prejudging a situation of just, oh, well, I think this is what happened just for whatever reason. We have our own inborn, feelings on things. And you want to evaluate every response for logic, clarity, and accuracy. If you're missing any of these, logic, clarity, or accuracy, your follow-up question should be to get that on whatever that topic was. Okay, so the interview closeout. Again, remember, closeout, we reflect the opening. Ask if they know anything they could have done or would do differently if faced with the task again to avoid the negative results. And phrase this in a way, right, of like, you're the expert, right? What should have happened? And you might get, you might get really kind of self-conscious examples of, I should have done this or should have done this, or you might get organizational ones. Well, I've been saying for 5 years if they would have fixed that thing, this wouldn't be a problem. But you want to put them in that position of expertise. And again, that's not a contrivance. They are more expert than you, typically. You want to summarize what you've learned and give them a general idea of how the investigation will proceed from this point. Most of the time with this, you're just going to be saying you have more interviews. And then, you write a report kind of thing. But, it's important to know if you're going to say, oh, I have to prepare a report for management, they might follow up and ask, will that be made public? That is one of those questions you might want to ask ahead of time of your management sponsors to see like what that answer is. You want to thank them and tell them you might need to contact them again. And then you give them your contact info so they can contact you if they have questions or if they remember anything important. Most people will have some kind of remembrance episode in the day after talking to you. It's just the way it works. Having an investigation, being interviewed, kind of a jarring process. It makes sense your mind would dwell on it, and as it dwells, serve up any additional info. So some key things to remember. You want to fight bias. So you want you don't want to be finding facts to suit theories. That's one of the biggest problems, right? You're making the facts fit your theory, not vice versa. Keep the proper perspective. Why did this event happen versus why did we let it happen? This kind of gets into some of that old view, new view distinction, but essentially, right, if we consider everybody is an active participant in a safety program or just the basic fundamental concept of safety, right, then why did we as an organization, as a society, whatever, let it happen? And the questions that needs to be answered. What happened? Why did it happen? Why didn't we see it coming? Why didn't we stop it before it got here? And what are we going to do about it? And this breaks down into these things, right? You've got your event, cause, barriers. Why didn't we stop it before it got here? This is typically an aspect of training or organizational stuff. Just kind of depends. And what are we going to do about it? This is our corrective actions. So keep that in mind. Now, problem statements. Again, this might be a little review if you've done accident investigation yet, but don't get predisposed to the cause in trying to determine the problem to be solved. Precisely define the problem to prevent, and you're halfway to the solution. It really is like one of the hardest parts of doing any investigation is what's the problem statement. Word problems are hard for a reason. Our brains crave context and explanatory facts. We need the why and other aspects of the event. We love a story. How many times we've all had the experience of reading a word problem in math and having questions about the sanity or the context or the reasonability of the actions being taken, right? But that's something you're going to fight against here, is including context. Creating a quality problem statement is the foundation of the whole analysis. So your problem statement needs to be a single, concise problem statement that identifies the specific issue that you're evaluating. You want to state the object and the deviation. So object, equipment, deviation, malfunction. Inappropriate behavior or process deficiency will also fall into there, right? The process is your object, deficiency, deviation. Details of the problem specified in terms of when, what, when might be applicable also, or when applicable may also be the object. That's the way I wrote that. The object and the deviation and consequence. Now these are kind of your rules of a problem statement. Do not state whys. Causes don't belong in a problem statement. Do not state potential corrective actions. Do identify the adverse effects or consequences of the stated problem and the severity of these consequences. Do ensure the problem statement contains only one problem or condition. It's a problem statement, not a statement of problems. Do use the problem statement to maintain focus during the investigation. This is the critical part. If you do the problem statement right, everything else ends up easier. Your interviews, you're answering questions in the problem statement. I mean, when you're looking at documents from the scene, the sketches or anything, guiding it from the problem statement. All of it just simplifies everything. So here's an example. On 12/19/2008 at 1641, with Unit 3 in Mode 3, a loose fuse connection in the control circuitry for 3HV4716, auxiliary feed water pump 3 Papa 140 steam inlet valve, caused the Unit 3 control room to receive alarm window 3UA0052A53, the turbine aux FW pump governor overspeed OOS alarm, notification 200253911. aux FW pump 3 Papa 140 was declared inoperable, 72-hour action statement at 1651, as per technical specification LC03.7.5, Action B, requiring 3 operable aux FW pumps in modes 1, 2, and 3. For those unaware, FW stands for feed water. But that was a nightmare. Like, I don't know about you. I just read this thing. I've read it countless times because it's in my slides. I don't remember anything about that. It's just too dense. It doesn't necessarily break any rules of, like, you know, there aren't like causes per se in here, or any of these things, but there's just a lot going on, and that's the problem. It's not concise. So what if we switched up? On 12/19/2008, a loose fuse connection in the control circuitry for auxiliary feed water pump 3P140 steam inlet valve resulted in declaring the pump inoperable. Very simple. We don't need to know about the alarms. We don't need to know all the specific model numbers or notification numbers. I like that they specified feed water here, right? You don't want to use jargon or acronyms in your problem statement. Nobody needs that. Define your terms. So this is just so much easier. So imagine this is your problem statement that you get. You have to do interviews and such things, right? What are you going to be looking into? This loose fuse. That's it. You might spend a little bit of time on this inoperable pump thing. Why is it inoperable? Is that a problem that it's inoperable? Because you do, depending on your situation, you might have requirements to have a certain number of pumps, etc. That's what they were talking about the technical specification before. But primarily, what's the issue? That's your problem. So that's it. That's what you guide everything about. So timelines of accident investigations, these are in days, so you typically are gonna have, your 5-day, 7-day, 14, etc. We typically, and this is true at least where I work too, I can't remember exactly what the CBI stands for, but for us it's usually 60 days. I think 90 days on a root cause, but this is the process, right? It's pretty fast. And again, why is it fast? Because time and memory are our problems. So this is kind of where we're going here. So developing your sequence of events, this is also incredibly important, right? This is where you're going to compare the sequence of events that actually happened against your optimal sequence of events. So you want to understand logical order, the fact-based order, and you're focusing on the cause, not the blame. That's going to get repeated, right? That's an aspect of that just culture stuff. Understanding the characteristics of an event, your actors versus your actions will be important to highlight. And remember our systems causation stuff and challenges in determining the true sequence of events. Unless we have like overwhelming amounts of physical evidence, video recordings, etc., and an incredibly simple situation, we will probably never get to the true sequence of events. There are just aspects that aren't accessible beyond that point if they're not frozen in time in some way. So that's also important to note, right? We're getting our best approximation. Then you're going to do your surface and root cause analysis. We won't spend a ton of time on this because this is you should have gone into this in a lot of depth in accident investigation. But in terms of cause analysis, we have surface causes and root causes, right? If you were doing a root cause analysis, your surface causes also might fall into causal factors territory. But you're going to be looking at barrier analysis, which is how did my barriers fail? Change analysis, what went differently than the optimal process. Event and causal factor charting, this is a very robust method of doing these, but can be kind of time consuming. But it's very visual and interactive, which can help kind of get through a complex situation quickly and find your root cause, extent of, etc. So your cause and your conditions. You also might use task analysis. So this is partially will plug into change analysis, but we want to understand the task from the human perspective, right? Step away from the procedure, the policy, the engineering. How does a human perform these tasks? And you may start to find human performance challenges or design failures. You might find, remember, design failures. What can be designed? Everything. Processes, procedures, organizations, everything can be designed, right? Is this going to be, you work through it and they say, I have 8 different bosses to report to. Like you really doing a task analysis is essentially giving the human side of this. And again, from a human factors perspective, right? People are experts of their own experience, so we try to defer to them whenever possible about how they perform the tasks. Everybody wants to do the right thing when they're at work. Nobody wants to have an accident. So the way they're approaching it, even if it's not in accordance with a policy or a process, must make some sense to them, or they have a reason for doing it. Just saying, well, that's against procedure or policy, doesn't actually change anything. Okay, we want to. There's it's kind of a pendulum that goes back and forth, but especially more recently, we're talking more about fitting the worker to the task, but that's not successful typically. We want to fit the task to the worker. So what's wrong with the task and what do the humans deviate from it to get the job done? That's kind of where you want to look at. So determining your solutions, effective corrective action plans. I honestly think there could be an entire class just on corrective actions. They can be pretty tricky to do effectively. So you want a clear linkage between cause and corrective actions. Every cause has a corrective action, and every corrective action has a cause. Here's your guiding, commandment: don't make things worse. You want to include the intent or the desired outcome of the action in your corrective action write-up. This is a big thing. Sometimes people might execute your corrective action to the letter of the law, miss the spirit, it ends up being ineffective. So you want to typically include the intent. Document completed corrective actions. Most modern organizations will have some system for doing this. You will develop interim corrective actions. These are also going to be kind of sometimes people refer to them as immediate actions. So, think crime scene taping off an area. That's a corrective action that's immediate. For what purpose? To secure the scene, etc. So you'll have some interim ones. Consider the risk to repeat recurrence during the completion of the overall action plan. This is one blind spot a lot of people do. They save corrective actions for 30, 60, 90 days. In the meantime, you might have 3 more events. That's where your interim corrective action should be. Your interim corrective action should, as well as possible at this early stage, capture as many of the causes as possible so that while you're figuring out what actually happened and what your solution is, you don't continue to have recurrence of the issue, because that will occur. And lastly, write the report. So this will be governed a lot by your specific workspace, the content, the format, etc. But fundamentally, consider dissemination. So where's it going? Who's going to see it? Is this an NTSB report that's going to be released to the public, or is this internal, so it's private and even the employees won't see it? You need to consider that as you're writing. Your tone and circumstances of the report. Understand the goals of the overall investigation. Your problem statement might help there. And your report must reflect accuracy and not bias or politics, right? Your opinion does not matter. Unless you happen to be a subject matter expert in one of the things you're reviewing, your opinion doesn't have a place in the report. You're describing what happened and why. And as such, it shouldn't have any politics. That's easier said than done, but if you're doing this legitimately, the worries about how so and so may take this information, or oh, we have to write it this way so that it doesn't put the blame on this manager or whatever. All of that is just betraying the purpose of what we're doing. So that's probably the hardest thing, but the one that you will especially need to focus on. And I think that is it. So hopefully this recording method works a little bit better, and I don't get any issues. So I'll be interested to hear your feedback. Thanks.